Google offers emotional intelligence courses for its employees. And General Mills has a meditation room in every building on its corporate campus. Many companies are taking the emotional health bull by the horns when it comes to their employees. Joining us now to detail how much of this is about work-life balance as much as it is about the bottom line, we welcome Carla Lipsig-Mame, professor at York University's Department of Social Science, and Scott Sheeman. He is professor in the University of Toronto's Department of Sociology, and welcome you two back to TVO for you. It's been a while, but nice to have you back.
Thank you.
Scott, you for the first time. Scott, how significant is the shift that we've been talking about here that in the way that some companies are treating their employees?
You know, it matters a lot. I mean, I think the bottom line for a lot of workers is it's about the relationship to people and it's about the relationship to work. And so to the extent that companies and organizations are paying more attention to the factors that cause stress, the factors that reduce productivity and morale, those things are really important, and I think there is an increased focus on those.
Carla, do you have a sense about why this is happening now?
It's happening now because unions are weak. It's happening now, and I'd have to say, when I was listening to what you were saying, Scott, I was thinking, yes, people have a great need to feel the meaningfulness of their work and the connection to people, but it's not clear that that connection to people and to work needs to go through the boss. Mm-hmm. And the fact that it is going through the boss means that there is a space for employers to produce new ideas which are essentially very valuable to them.
You played the union card right off the top. Why does the strength or weakness of a union relate to this?
Unions create communities at work, and they have historically for back to the 1750s in England and a bit later here. And I can tell you from my own workspace, they create, if you will, a competing set of links and cultures to that which the employer might want to have. It's different. It will differ from, we can't really even easily say blue collar work and white collar work anymore, because tell me what a McDonald's worker is.
Which is that? Good question.
Well, in terms of the controls, it's certainly what we used to think of the blue collar and the workers who were controlled by, by Taylorism and things in scientific management. Unions do create an alternative culture in the workplaces where they have been over a long period of time. It's not even an alternative culture, it may be the basic culture where the employer is the one outside the tent, but it's been a long time since that's been declining.
Well, let me share this. This is you both know the Gallup organization, which does public opinion surveys. A couple of years ago, they did a State of the American Workplace report. They found that companies whose employees are comparatively more engaged generate 147% higher earnings per share. So, Scott, has the world of management suddenly discovered a human soul?
Good question. I think the notion of engagement is really important because of what you want, depending on the kind of work. You want clarity, focus. You want individuals to be able to feel like they're fully participating in the work that they're doing. And so in an era where you have more distractions, more interruptions, communication technologies, creating a lot of multitasking, I think there are a lot of things that can potentially threaten engagement. And so this notion of mindfulness, I think, is something that's been talked about more. And ultimately, what's that about? What's the purpose of being more mindful? Well, it's being in the moment, it's being able to solve problems and make decisions. And ultimately, all of those things are part of we might think of as an engaged worker. So I think that is more relevant, especially in an era where people feel more overwhelmed, feel more rushed for time and so forth. So yes, for sure, I think it's really increasing.
If we go back, Carla, to the 1920s with the human relations theory, can you expound on that and tell us how that might relate to what's going on right now?
Yes. Can I say one thing, though? Everybody is stressed for time. From the janitor who has to travel quite a far distance on odd shifts to get to and from work. The time poverty is everywhere, and it's not a question of just being at the top or even in the middle of the track. Human relations theory and practice in the 20s came about because the idea was, and you know, it's not difficult to give workers cheery lunchrooms, decent workspaces, and they'll be happier. And indeed, they were happier. But that is a collective theory. In other words, in the sense that they weren't concentrating on each and every worker, they were concentrating on the environment in which workers worked.
Well, collective sounds more Canadian than American, and I know you've studied both, right? Does the research show any difference between what side of the border you happen to be working on?
Difference in terms of the pressures people are facing, or
and how well management sort of respects the themes that we've been talking about here?
I think that's more tricky for me to answer because I'm not as familiar with the management side. But in terms of the stress element, I think some of the demands are quite similar. I mean, I think it's a really good point that the inequality hurts people at the bottom more than people through the middle, for sure. But some of the issues related to the stress that individuals are feeling does definitely matter as you move up. And I think, so issues of precarity, for example, or issues of...
Better explain that. Issues of precarity?
The possibility that you might lose your work, lose your job, non-standard kinds of work, part-time, seasonal, perhaps. Just if you think of the idea of security and more secure, stable employment versus a lot of uncertainty, those cut across the spectrum, but definitely hurt people more at the bottom.
There is stress in the workplace today, of course. But Scott, is it any worse than it was, say, 25 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago when you didn't have workplace safety rules in place?
It's different. I think it's different. I mean, if you think about what is it that puts pressure or burdens on individual workers? It's changed depending on the kind of work that you do. So if you're doing more work that involves working with ideas or creative work and so forth, the kind of communication technologies, the email, the crush of email that people face. And this gets back to the idea of mindfulness. I mean, one of the things that we see in our research is people talking about feeling interrupted. And so if you think about, you know, if your mind was in two places during a conversation, are you fully engaged? And I think that's something that affects workers more now. The other thing is work-life fit, work-life need. The balance idea is different because of the nature of dual earning households and what individuals face in terms of financial needs. And overwork is a different kind of issue. Long work hours, often because of work intensification. More work and less time to do it. Yeah.
Technology is a big factor there, the emails. One of the big French unions has negotiated and signed an agreement with a very major communications conglomerate to say no emails are allowed after 6 p.m.
And do people stick to that?
History is silent for the moment.
Here's a title you don't see at too many companies. Google has a job called the Jolly Good Fellow. He is the head of mindfulness training at Google. His role is to enlighten minds, open hearts, create world peace. And he had this to say: if you are a company leader who says employees should be encouraged to exercise, nobody looks at you funny. The same thing is happening to meditation and mindfulness, because now that it's become scientific, it has been demystified. It's going to be seen as fitness for the mind. You think so?
It's a catchy phrase. It's a question of whether an employer should have the right to intervene in the private lives of their workers. Now, they do so, but meditation's not for everyone. I could give you a rather cynical spiel about it, and it shouldn't have to be for everyone.
Well, if you're at York University,
yep.
If York University decided that it was in the interests of you, your students, and the whole ambiance of the place to give everybody from 1 till 2 every afternoon an hour to meditate, how's that sort of not in their business?
The union would say so.
So the union would fight that?
Oh, it absolutely would say give them the hour, but let them use it as they please. Okay.
And if management wanted to say, we think this is the best use of that hour,
they wouldn't be so unwise.
They wouldn't be so unwise to urge that.
Or to try and negotiate it, because this would all be going through collective agreements.
I see.
Sorry.
Is that a level of complication in the workplace that's unhelpful in this day and age?
Oh, that's loaded. So I like your first question, if I can go back. So if you step back and reflect on what mindfulness and meditation is about, setting aside the forcing people to do it, it's not a bad idea for anyone in any role to be in the moment. Maybe that's a little too new agey, but feeling relaxed, calm, and centered in any role relationship, whether it's with your children, with your parents, with your spouse or partner, with your dog, enjoying that moment and being centered. And if there are certain things that can get us to that focus, clarity, if there's some kind of program, some people say even just taking a 10-minute walk where you're putting your mind at ease can actually bring you back to a certain kind of focus. So that's kind of a more general answer. Now, to the extent that that's actually implemented in the workplace is more challenging.
Can
Please.
Absolutely, all those things, the 10-minute walk, the dog, but no, every one of them. But those are things for people to construct for themselves, I think, is that question.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And I'm also thinking that the time poverty and the stress is very much, it impacts the middle class as well, because in a sense, and this is all the precarious employment and growing gap and inequality of wage studies that have been going on, and programs now in Toronto revealing it, is effectively the middle class is collapsing into a more precarious position. And I'm not sure that's either company or individuals, but public policy that plays a role there.
Yeah, there are different levels, and I think on one level, if you're just talking about clutter and clearing the mind and what makes people effective and focused, that's one set of ideas. But then you have all these other structural precarity and those kinds of things which are more broader structural, which are more complex, versus the individual worker and what he or she can do to be more effective in coping with stress, I think.
It's a great coincidence that you two from University of Toronto and York University are here in this studio, given that you're discussing this subject, given that there is a workplace, what do you want to call it? Strike.
Two
Very
strikes.
good.
Two
there
strikes.
are 2 strikes by your teaching assistants at each of your institutions of higher learning over some of the issues I presume that we're talking about here today. Carla, is that fair to say that some of what we're talking about is the reason why the TAs are out?
Yes, and it's...
I know you don't, first of all, let me add, you two don't speak for your institutions, you speak for yourselves.
Thank you.
So we put that on the record.
Good. Yes, it is. There was a phrase that was used in Quebec for many years for the nurses. Précaire un jour, précaire toujours. Precarious once, precarious forever. And that does apply to certain groups inside the TAs and the contract faculty who are striking. I mean, with extraordinary degrees, with extraordinary CVs, etc. Their anxiety about work absolutely shapes their life. There was a long article in one of the newspapers in the last 2 weeks about a TA finishing his PhD, 1 course at York, 1 course at the last minute at McMaster. Then he gets a 2nd course at McMaster the next year, but it's a different course, and in other words, and he travels back and forth, and he has a young baby. And it was just a long interview. The stresses of work and the stresses of life when we are post-welfare state interweave. You talk about levels, Scott, but also the levels sometimes interweave with each other, and sometimes they clash with each other terribly.
Scott?
Yeah, I think no matter where you stand on the issue structurally, we do know that feeling under-rewarded in the workplace and feeling a sense of inequity is a major stressor for a lot of people, and it's not equally distributed in the population. The pain is not equally distributed. It's much harder for people at the lower end of the income scale. And so one of the main issues is what's enough, the issues about living wage and so forth. Those are important questions, but the bottom line is when workers feel under-rewarded, they're less satisfied, they're less likely to stick around. You have all sorts of problems. So no matter what, it's in everyone's interest to make everyone feel they're getting what they deserve. But it's hard to do. It's tricky. It's
also important where that making them feel better comes from. The HR, the human relations theory of the 20s went about it, the workers as a community, as a group, because we needed to work with it. No matter what work you do, ultimately you need to do some work together.
Right.
Fast forward to now and the meditation and the mindfulness, this is individual focus with no sense of the work community, which people need.
Absolutely. You could become centered and then go back to the role and suddenly find yourself having to do 12 hours of work in 8 hours. And so the structural stuff is really, really critical.
Right.
And so it's not just about individuals solving.
I've got about a minute and a half to go here. I want to read this last quote and then get you both to comment on it briefly. This is from the New Republic. We should embrace not the meaningfulness of work, but its meaninglessness. The cold, unromantic transaction, the part that keeps food in our bellies and a roof over our heads, the part that theoretically gives us our nights and weekends. Let's demand that recompense, first and foremost, and deal with the rest later. With unemployment falling to pre-recession levels, employees are hopefully gaining the leverage to say enough. The prayer is that the line will be drawn and managers will then see that the way forward is actually very simple. Hire good people, treat them well, help them succeed, compensate them fairly, let them go home. Scott, thoughts?
All kinds of issues with that. I mean, compensate them fairly. It's something we were just talking about. I mean, that's right off the bat a really important issue. Let them go home is an important aspect too, because increasingly you asked what's different between before and now. The blurring lines between work and family, work spilling over, work creep, it's almost normative now.
Right. Carla, last word?
I wished I had said that myself. Let's see, how did we start? Treat
them well,
compensate,
help them succeed, compensate them fairly, let them go home.
I'd love to have that as my motto.
Sums it up nicely, eh?
It's beautifully.
Okay,
Thank
beautiful.
You.
Scott Sheeman, Carla Lipsig-Mumme, good of you to join us at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.